Higher powers have stepped in to unite two lonely hearts. But do they want this? Of course not. However, it seems these forces don't care about their desires because there are wizards who are simply a perfect match. Trust me, this story is going to be interesting. The first thing Hermione Granger became aware of wasn't the rhythmic ticking of the clock on her mantelpiece, nor the soft grey light of a London dawn filtering through her linen curtains. It was a scent. It was the sharp, cool aroma of sandalwood and expensive parchment, laced with the metallic tang of winter air. It was a scent that absolutely did not belong in a flat that usually smelled of cinnamon tea and old paper. She didn't open her eyes immediately. Instead, she felt the unfamiliar weight of the duvet. Usually, she slept curled into a neat ball on the left side of the mattress. But today, there was a heat radiating from the right, a steady, living warmth that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. Hermione exhaled slowly, her breath hitching in the quiet room. Not again, she thought, the words a silent, desperate plea to whatever mischievous deity had decided to ruin her schedule for the third time this week. She turned her head an inch at a time. The movement caused the silk pillowcase to rustle, a sound that felt like a thunderclap in the heavy silence. There, less than a handbreadth away, lay Draco Malfoy. He was devastatingly composed even in sleep. His pale hair was a chaotic halo against the dark fabric, a few stray strands falling over a forehead that was usually knit with a permanent, arrogant frown. Without the sneer, without the weight of his family's history pressing into the corners of his mouth, he looked startlingly young. His eyelashes cast long, jagged shadows against high cheekbones, and his jaw was finally, mercifully relaxed. Hermione watched the slow, even rise and fall of his chest. He was wearing his silk pajamas, monogrammed of course, and the silver embroidery of the M caught the faint morning light, mocking her. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the sleeve of his robe. She wanted to shake him, to shove him off the bed, to scream into the quiet air until the wards of her flat vibrated. Instead, her hand trembled, and she found herself tracing the air above the line of his shoulder. There was a magnetic pull in the space between them, a static charge that made the air feel thick, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Then, the rhythm of his breathing changed. It hitched, sharpened, and Malfoy's eyes snapped open. They weren't the cold, flinty grey of a courtroom or a battlefield. In the softness of the morning, they were the colour of rain-washed slate. For a heartbeat, there was no hostility, only a hazy, disoriented vulnerability that made Hermione's heart perform a jagged, uncomfortable somersault in her chest. Then, reality set in. Draco's pupils dilated. His body went rigid, the muscles in his neck cording, as he realized exactly whose ceiling he was staring at. He didn't jump. Malfoy's didn't jump. He simply froze, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of her duvet. "Granger," he rasped. His voice was a low, rough friction that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. "Malfoy," she replied, her own voice remarkably steady despite the frantic drumming in her ears. She sat up, pulling the covers to her chin, a defensive reflex she hated herself for. This is becoming a habit, a very, very bad habit. Draco sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair, destroying the last of its curated order. He looked around the room, at the stack of books on her nightstand, at the stray wool sock on the rug, with an expression of profound, exhausted bewilderment. I was in the manor, he muttered, more to himself than to her. He rubbed his face with both hands, the friction of his palms against his skin sounding loud in the room. I was in my library. I had a glass of fire whiskey. I was reading a treatise on celestial navigation. And now you are in a one-bedroom flat in Bloomsbury, Hermione countered, swinging her legs out of bed. She felt the chill of the floorboards bite at her soles, a grounding sensation. For the third time in 7 days. My wards are keyed to the ministry's highest standards, Draco. An ancient dragon couldn't sneeze its way through my front door without triggering an alarm. And yet, here you are, in my bed, again. Draco swung his legs over the opposite side of the bed, sitting with his back to her. His shoulders were hunched, a rare break in his aristocratic posture. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was pressurized, like the atmosphere before a summer storm. "Do you think I want to be here?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried a sharp edge of bitterness. "Do you think I enjoy waking up to the smell of whatever flowery nonsense you wash your sheets in? To the sight of your abysmal taste in decor?" Hermione felt the familiar spark of irritation, a warm, comfortable anger that shielded her from the sheer absurdity of the situation. "My decor is perfectly functional, and if you hate it so much, stop breaking in." "I am not breaking in," Draco roared softly, spinning around to face her. The grey in his eyes was now a stormy, turbulent sea. He stood up, his height suddenly dominating the small space. "I am being pulled. It feels like a hook behind my navel, Granger. One moment I am sitting in a chair, and the next the world folds, and I am falling into your lavender-scented abyss." He paced the length of the room, the silk of his robes snapping around his ankles. Hermione watched him, her eyes tracking the frantic energy he radiated. He stopped in front of her full-length mirror, staring at his reflection as if he didn't recognize the man standing in a Gryffindor's bedroom. "This is a curse," he said, his voice trembling with a suppressed emotion she couldn't quite name. Fear, humiliation. "Someone is targeting us. Someone wants the Malfoy name dragged through the mud of a scandal so ridiculous that—" "Oh, stop being so dramatic," Hermione interrupted, though her fingers were busy twisting the hem of her sleeve, a nervous habit she couldn't suppress. "If it were a curse, I would have felt the magical residue. I've scanned the room twice. There's nothing but a faint linger of elven magic. It's clean. Too clean." Draco stopped pacing. He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching her face for a sign that she was joking. He saw only the clinical, sharp intelligence that had always made him feel exposed. "Elven magic?" he repeated. "It's a possibility," she said, standing up and walking toward her wardrobe. She needed a barrier. She grabbed his heavy velvet traveling cloak, which had appeared on her armchair alongside him, and threw it at his chest. "Put that on. I can't have you wandering through my kitchen in your pajamas. My neighbour, Mrs. Fig, already thinks I'm a nun. Let's not shatter her illusions yet." Draco caught the cloak, his fingers sinking into the familiar fabric. He didn't put it on immediately. He stood there, watching her move around the room with a brisk, forced efficiency. He saw the way she avoided looking at the spot on the bed where he had been lying. He saw the slight tremor in her hand as she reached for her wand. "Granger," he said softly. She stopped, her back to him. "What?" I didn't do this." The admission was quiet, stripped of his usual armor. It was a plea for her to believe him, not because he cared about her opinion, but because the alternative, that he was losing control of his own existence, was too much to bear. Hermione turned. She saw the hollow look in his eyes, the way the light from the window emphasized the shadows beneath them. The tension in her chest shifted, softening from irritation into something more complex, something that felt dangerously like empathy. "I know," she said, her voice dropping to a gentler register. "I know you didn't. You're too much of a coward to face me while I'm awake, let alone while I'm sleeping." It was a jab, a return to their usual rhythm, but it lacked its usual sting. Draco let out a short, dry laugh, a sound like dead leaves skittering across stone. "Fair point," he conceded. He threw the cloak over his shoulders, the heavy fabric instantly transforming him back into the formidable wizard the world knew. But the illusion was spoiled by the fact that he was still standing in a room that smelled of her. "Saturday," Hermione said, pointing a finger at him. "The weekend. We are going to figure this out. I'm coming to the manor. We're going to audit your wards, your staff, and every cursed object in your vault if we have to." Draco narrowed his eyes. "The manor? You wouldn't step foot there for 5 years." "That was before you started using my bed as a portkey," she snapped. "Saturday, Malfoy. Don't be late." "I'm already here, Granger," he reminded her with a ghost of a smirk, a flicker of his old self returning. "Technically, I'm 3 days early." "Out," she pointed to the door, "and take your sandalwood scent with you. It's distracting." He didn't move for a moment. He looked at her, his gaze lingering on the messy curls of her hair, the defiant set of her jaw, and the way the morning light made her skin look like polished amber. For a second, the atmospheric pressure in the room spiked again. The distance between them felt like a physical weight, a tether pulling tight. Then, with a crisp, elegant turn, he walked toward her front door. "See you tomorrow, then," he said over his shoulder. His voice regained its polished, aristocratic sheen. "Since the universe seems to insist on it." As the door clicked shut behind him, Hermione sank back onto the edge of the bed. The spot where he had been lying was still warm. She pressed her palm against the fabric, feeling the lingering heat, and closed her eyes. The silence of the flat felt louder than it ever had before. It wasn't a peaceful silence anymore. It was an expectant one, a hollow space waiting to be filled. And deep down, in a place she refused to acknowledge, a small, treacherous part of her wondered if the hook he felt behind his navel was starting to tug at her too. The halls of the Ministry of Magic felt unusually narrow that Tuesday, the stone walls pressing inward with the weight of 1,000 secrets and the suffocating scent of damp parchment. Hermione moved through the level 2 corridor with a velocity that suggested she was chasing a fleeing suspect rather than merely heading to a mundane meeting on cauldron bottom thickness. Her heels clicked against the polished tiles in a frantic, syncopated rhythm, a sound that echoed her own racing thoughts. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the ghost of a silver monogrammed M. Every time the air grew still, she smelled sandalwood. "Granger!" The voice didn't come from a distance. It materialized right beside her ear, low and vibrating with a familiar, weary elegance. Hermione didn't just stop. She recoiled, her shoulder glancing off the cold stone of a decorative archway. Her breath hitched, trapped in the back of her throat, as she found herself staring directly into the pale, sharp features of Draco Malfoy. He was dressed in charcoal robes that screamed of old money and quiet power, his leather satchel slung over one shoulder with a casual grace that made her own frantic movements feel clumsy. But it was his eyes that betrayed him. They were restless, darting to her hands, then her face, then the floor. "Must you lurk, Malfoy?" she whispered, her fingers flying to the buttons of her cardigan, checking for the third time that they were fastened correctly. I wasn't lurking. I was walking to the Department of International Cooperation, minding my own business, when I felt a pull, he said, the last word landing like a heavy stone in a quiet pond. He took a half step toward her, then immediately checked the movement, his boots scuffing the floor. "The static. Can't you feel it?" Hermione felt it. It was a prickling sensation at the nape of her neck, a low-frequency hum that seemed to sync with the beating of her heart. It was as if 1,000 tiny invisible needles were stitching the air between them together. When he moved closer, the pressure eased. When he moved away, it felt like her skin was being stretched too thin. "It's localized," she noted, her voice trembling slightly. She pulled a small brass arithmancy device from her pocket, a series of interlocking rings that began to spin frantically the moment they were near him. "The magical displacement from this morning hasn't dissipated. It's following us." Draco leaned in to look at the device. He was so close she could see the faint, rhythmic pulse in his throat. The scent of him, that cool, metallic winter air, wrapped around her like a physical weight. "Is it dangerous?" he asked, his voice losing its defensive edge. "I don't know," she admitted, her eyes fixed on the spinning rings. "But it's persistent. It's as if the magic is trying to reconcile 2 points in space that shouldn't be touching. Every time we encounter each other, the tether tightens." A group of interns rounded the corner, their laughter dying in their throats as they saw the Golden Girl and the Malfoy heir standing in a tense, intimate huddle in a dark corridor. Draco straightened immediately, his face hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated boredom. He stepped back, and Hermione felt a sharp, phantom pain in her chest, the literal snap of the magical tension being forced apart. "Saturday," he reminded her, his voice now a cold, distant rasp. "I expect you at the gates at 10. If you're late, I'll assume you've been swallowed by your own library." "I'm never late, Malfoy," she snapped back, but her hand stayed on the cold stone of the wall long after he had disappeared into the crowd, seeking the only thing that felt stable in a world that was suddenly tilting on its axis. The rest of the week was a blur of frantic research and sleepless nights. Hermione spent her evenings surrounded by stacks of ancient texts on house elf lore and spatial anomalies. She ignored the invitations to the leaky cauldron, ignored Harry's concerned owls, and focused entirely on the Bibsy variable. She found references to the bond of the hearth, an obscure, almost sentient form of magic practiced by elven lines that had served the same family for more than 5 centuries. It wasn't just service. It was a biological imperative to ensure the thriving of the house. By the time Friday night arrived, Hermione was vibrating with a mixture of exhaustion and a strange, frantic anticipation. She didn't want to sleep. Sleeping meant the possibility of waking up to the sight of him again, and she wasn't sure her frayed nerves could handle a 4th encounter in the dark. She stayed up until 3 in the morning, nursing a cup of cold tea, watching the shadows dance on her wall. When she finally succumbed to sleep, it was a heavy, dreamless plunge. She woke to the sound of rain. It was a soft, rhythmic patter against a window pane that sounded much larger than her own. The air was different, heavy with the scent of damp earth, old stone, and the faint, sweet perfume of drying roses. The bed beneath her wasn't her firm, narrow mattress. It was a vast sea of down and Egyptian cotton that seemed to swallow her whole. Hermione bolted upright. She wasn't in her flat. She was in a bedroom that could only be described as a cathedral of silver and green. High, vaulted ceilings disappeared into the gloom, and a massive fireplace of black marble crackled with a low blue flame. And beside her, propped up on one elbow, was Draco. He wasn't sleeping this time. He was watching her, his chin resting on his hand, his expression unreadable. He looked as if he had been awake for hours, his hair perfectly swept back, wearing a silk dressing gown that looked like it cost more than her entire education. "Welcome to the manor, Granger," he said quietly. There was no mockery in his tone, only a profound, dark exhaustion. "It appears the magic has grown impatient with your Saturday appointment." Hermione looked down at herself. She was still in her flannel pajamas, the ones with the tiny golden snitches on them, and she felt a hot, prickling blush creep up her neck. She scrambled to the far edge of the bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "How?" she gasped, her eyes darting toward the door. "The same way as before," Draco said, sitting up. He reached out as if to touch a stray curl of her hair, but caught himself, his fingers curling into a fist in midair. "I woke up, and you were just there, like a ghost that had finally decided to haunt the right house." He stood up and walked toward the fireplace, his movements stiff. The light of the blue flames cast long, distorted shadows across the room. Hermione watched him, her mind racing to categorize the sensory data. The bite of the cold air outside the covers, the velvet texture of the rug under her feet as she climbed out of the bed, the way the silence of the manor felt alive, as if the walls were listening. "We need to find her," Hermione said, her voice sounding small in the vast room. "We need to find Bibbsy." "She's in the kitchens," Draco said, not turning around. "I tried to summon her an hour ago. She refused to come. She sent a note saying, 'The young master must learn to entertain his guests without interference.'" A hysterical laugh bubbled up in Hermione's throat. "Guests? I'm an intruder. You're a Granger," Draco interrupted, turning to face her. His eyes were haunted, the grey iris almost swallowed by black. "And according to the ancient stones of this house, you are the most compatible magical signature to enter these wards in 300 years. Do you have any idea what that does to a house that has been starving for something other than me?" He took a step toward her, the space between them suddenly crackling with that familiar atmospheric pressure. It wasn't just the magic anymore. It was the raw, jagged friction of two people who had spent a decade defining themselves by their mutual loathing, only to find the ground disappearing beneath them. "I can't be here, Draco," she whispered, using his first name without realizing it. "I can't be the thing that fixes your house." "I know," he said, his voice a low, broken rasp. He reached out then, his hand trembling as he tucked a lock of hair behind her ear. The contact was electric, a visceral, jarring impact that made Hermione gasp. His skin was cold, but the heat where they touched was blinding. Believe me, I know. I've spent every night since Monday trying to convince myself that I'm dreaming, that I don't actually want to wake up and see you there. The honesty of the statement was more terrifying than any curse. Hermione looked up at him, her breath hitching as she saw the sheer, unvarnished vulnerability in his gaze. He wasn't the arrogant boy from the hallways anymore. He was a man struggling against a tide he couldn't control, and for the first time, she realized she was drowning right alongside him. "We have to stop this," she said, though she didn't pull away from his touch. Her own hand rose, her fingers ghosting over the silk of his sleeve, seeking the solid reality of him beneath the fabric. "Then let's go," he said, his knuckles whitening as he pulled his hand away. "Let's go find that miserable elf and end this before we do something we can't take back." He turned and strode toward the door, the heavy oak swinging open before he could even touch the handle. Hermione followed, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floors, her mind a whirlwind of fear and a strange, shimmering hope she didn't dare name. As they descended the grand staircase, the manor seemed to lean in toward them. The portraits whispered, their painted eyes following the pair with a mixture of shock and approval. The air grew thicker, more humid as they approached the lower levels, the scent of ozone and ancient magic becoming almost overwhelming. They reached the kitchen doors, a pair of massive iron-bound slabs that looked like they belonged in a fortress. Draco pushed them open, and the scene inside was not what Hermione expected. There was no darkness, no bubbling cauldrons. Instead, the room was filled with light, thousands of floating candles that cast a warm, golden glow over a table laden with enough food to feed an army. And in the center of it, all stood Bibbsy. She was a tiny, wizened creature, wearing a tea towel that had been bleached so white it glowed. Her large, tennis-ball eyes were wet with tears, and she was clutching a heavy, leather-bound ledger to her chest as if it were a holy relic. "Master Draco," she squeaked, her voice trembling with a terrifyingly sincere devotion. "Miss Granger, you are late for breakfast. Bibbsy has prepared the compatibility feast. The bloodlines must be fed." Draco stopped, his jaw dropping. "Bibbsy? What in the name of Merlin are you talking about?" The elf didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her tiny feet clicking on the flagstones. "The magic does not lie, Master. Bibbsy saw the charts. Miss Granger is the apex match. She is the intellect to your chaos, the light to your shadow. The manor was dying, Master Draco. It was turning to dust and silence. But when she comes, the stones sing." Draco let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He looked at Hermione, then back at the elf, his face pale. You've been kidnapping her. You've been dragging a member of the Wizengamot into my bed because the stones were lonely." "Not kidnapping, Master," Bibbsy protested, her ears flapping indignantly. "Facilitating. The magic does the pulling. Bibbsy just removes the obstacles. The wards were very stubborn, but Miss Granger's soul is very welcoming." Hermione felt the world spin. Welcoming? Her soul was welcoming Draco Malfoy. She looked at Draco, expecting to see a sneer, a mocking comment, anything to return them to the safety of their war. But he wasn't looking at the elf anymore. He was looking at her. And in his eyes, she saw the terrifying realization that the elf wasn't just talking about magic. She was talking about the truth that both of them had been burying under layers of pride and history for years. The tension in the room snapped, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Bibbsy stood there, a tiny architect of their destruction or their salvation, and waited. "Saturday," Draco whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the candles. "I told you I'd see you Saturday." Hermione didn't answer. She couldn't. She just watched as he turned back to the elf, his shoulders shaking with a sudden, silent tremor that she realized, with a shock of pure adrenaline, was the beginning of a breakdown. The kitchen of Malfoy Manor, usually a place of cold efficiency and shadows, was suffocatingly bright. The thousands of candles Bibbsy had summoned pulsed with a rhythmic, golden light that seemed to beat in time with the thrumming of the house's ancient heart. Hermione felt as if she was standing inside a massive living organism. Every stone beneath her bare feet felt warm, vibrating with a desperate, hungry sort of approval. Draco's laughter was a jagged, jarring sound, not the cool, mocking snicker of his youth, but a raw, splintering noise that threatened to shatter the fragile atmosphere of the room. He took a step toward the fireplace, his hand rising to grip the mantle of the secondary hearth, used for warming plates. His knuckles were so white they looked like polished bone. "The stones sing, Bibbsy?" he asked, his voice climbing an octave, laced with a frantic, hysterical edge. "You've turned the Malfoy legacy into a glorified matchmaking service? You've spent centuries guarding this family's dignity, only to throw me into the bed of the one woman who has every reason to wish I didn't exist?" Bibbsy didn't cower. She straightened her tiny starched tea towel and looked up at him with a gaze that was disturbingly maternal. "The young master is lonely," she stated, her voice a sharp, high-pitched whistle of certainty. The young master stares at the portraits, and the portraits stare back with dead eyes. Master Draco reads until his eyes bleed, but there is no one to argue with him, no one to tell him he is wrong, no one to make his mind spark like a flint against steel. She turned her large, luminous eyes toward Hermione. "Miss Granger is the flint. The magic found her because it had to. If Bibbsy did not help, the master would simply fade into the grey. The manor would become a tomb." Hermione felt a cold shiver trace the line of her spine. She looked at Draco, who was now leaning his forehead against the cold marble of the mantel. His eyes were closed, his breathing coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The emotional brokenness he usually kept locked behind layers of occlumency was leaking out, visible in the way his shoulders trembled beneath the expensive silk of his robe. "I'm not a tool, Bibbsy," Hermione said, her voice sounding thin and reedy in her own ears. "You can't just harvest a person for their compatibility. I have a life. I have a career. I have a home that doesn't smell like a museum of the dark arts." "But Miss Granger does not sleep well there," Bibbsy countered, stepping closer. The elf's proximity felt like a heat lamp. "In the flat, Miss Granger's mind never stops. It is like a clock that is overwound. But here," she pointed a spindly finger at the bed they had just vacated upstairs. "Here, beside the master, the clock slows down. Bibbsy sees the magic. It settles, like dust after a windstorm." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with a truth that Hermione had been trying to ignore for 3 days. She had slept better. Even with the shock of waking up next to him, The actual hours of slumber had been deep, dark and restorative in a way she hadn't experienced since before the war. Draco suddenly pushed off from the fireplace. He didn't look at Hermione. He looked at the elf, his face a mask of desperate, contained fury. "Enough," he rasped. "End it. Whatever ritual you're using, whatever tether you forged between my bed and her flat, break it. Now." "Bibsy cannot, Master," the elf whispered, her ears drooping. "The tether is not a spell. It is a recognition. Once the manor recognized Miss Granger, it claimed her. It is not a cage, Master. It is a bridge. To break it, one must prove the compatibility is false." "Fine," Draco shouted, the word echoing off the copper pans hanging from the ceiling. "We will prove it. We'll spend the weekend here. We'll be as incompatible as possible. We will argue, we will disagree, we will find every jagged edge of each other's souls until the house realizes its mistake." He finally turned to Hermione, his eyes wild and rimmed with red. "You heard her, Granger. She won't let go until the magic is satisfied. So, welcome to Malfoy Manor. I hope you're prepared to hate me more than you ever have, because it's the only way you're getting back to your perfectly functional life." The tension between them was no longer just atmospheric. It was visceral. It was the feeling of a bowstring drawn so tight the wood was starting to groan. The first hour of their incompatibility experiment was spent in the library. It was Draco's idea, the most intellectual space in the house where their egos were most likely to clash. Hermione sat at a massive mahogany table, her fingers tracing the edge of a stack of books she didn't want to read. Draco sat opposite her, 3 feet away, staring into the middle distance. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and the ozone of the wards outside. "Your filing system is archaic," Hermione said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. She reached for a quill and began to aggressively straighten a pile of parchment. "It's based on the Peveril classification, isn't it? It's elitist and inefficient." Draco didn't snap back. He merely shifted his weight, the silver ring on his finger clicking against the wood of the table. "It's a system that has preserved these texts for 8 centuries, Granger. Efficiency is for people who don't have enough time to appreciate the weight of history." "History shouldn't be a weight," she countered, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the quill. "It should be a foundation. You're drowning in it." "And you," he said, finally looking at her, his gaze sharp and piercing, "are trying to outrun it. You move so fast, you organize so much, you fix every little thing, because if you stopped for 1 second, you'd realize that you're just as haunted as I am." Hermione felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated irritation. It was the "can't stand it" she had been waiting for, the friction that was supposed to drive them apart. But beneath the anger, there was a magnetic pull, a desire to lean closer, to see if the grey of his eyes would change if she pressed the point further. She stood up, her chair screeching against the floor. "I am going to find Bibsy and tell her that your library is a mess and your worldview is even worse." She turned to leave, but as she passed his chair, her sleeve caught on a protruding piece of silver inlay on the table. She stumbled, and instinctively, Draco's hand shot out to catch her. His fingers clamped around her wrist. The impact was like a physical blow. A surge of magic, warm, golden, and terrifyingly intimate, rushed through the point of contact. Hermione gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. Draco didn't let go. He stared at his own hand, his breath catching, as if he were holding a live wire. The static in the room increased until it felt like the air itself was trembling. Hermione's gaze dropped to his hand, his long, elegant fingers, the bite of his ring against her skin, the way his pulse was visible in his wrist, mirroring the frantic beat of her own. "Let go," she whispered, though she didn't pull away. "I can't," he replied, his voice a low, strangled sound. "The house, it's holding us." It wasn't just the house. It was the sheer, undeniable gravity of their presence in the same space. For years, they had been two celestial bodies orbiting a shared trauma, never allowed to touch. Now, the collision was happening in slow motion, and neither of them knew how to survive the impact. Draco's thumb brushed against the soft skin of her inner wrist, a movement so subtle it might have been an accident. But it wasn't. It was a question, a tentative reach into the dark. Hermione's eyes snapped to his. She saw the internal conflict raging there, the guilt of his past, the pride of his name, and the terrifying, broken hope that he didn't have to be alone anymore. She felt her own prejudices, the principled version of herself, shuddering under the weight of his vulnerability. "This isn't going to work, is it?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. "No," Draco said, his eyes darkening. "I think the house is much smarter than we are." He released her suddenly, pulling his hand back as if he had been burned. The sudden loss of contact felt like a drop in temperature, a cold void where the heat had been. He stood up and walked to the far end of the library, disappearing into the shadows of the stacks. Hermione remained by the table, her hand resting on her wrist, her heart a frantic, trapped thing. She realized with a sinking feeling that they weren't just in a magical trap set by an elf. They were in a trap of their own making, forged by years of unspoken tension and the sudden, terrifying realization that they might actually belong exactly where they were. Outside, the rain intensified, turning into a full-scale thunderstorm. The windows of the manor rattled, and the blue flames in the fireplaces leaped higher, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Hermione wandered through the corridors, her mind a maze of what-ifs and shouldn'ts. She found herself in a small, sunless gallery filled with portraits of Malfoy ancestors. They all looked like Draco, sharp, elegant, and desperately lonely behind their gilded frames. She stopped in front of a portrait of a woman with Draco's eyes and a sad, knowing smile. "Is this what you wanted?" Hermione thought. "A Granger to wake up the ghosts." The air behind her shifted. She didn't need to turn to know he was there. The scent of sandalwood and winter air preceded him, a sensory herald of his presence. "That's my great-aunt Cygnus," Draco said, his voice coming from just over her shoulder. He was standing close enough that she could feel the radiating warmth of his body. She spent 40 years in this gallery because she refused to marry a man the magic didn't choose. She died waiting for a singing stone. "Do you believe in it?" Hermione asked, still looking at the portrait. "The idea that we don't have a choice? That the magic decides who we are meant for?" Draco moved to stand beside her. He looked at the portrait, his jaw tight. "I spent most of my life believing that my choices didn't matter, that my name and my blood were my destiny. Then the war happened, and I realized that destiny is just a word we use to excuse our cowardice." He turned to her, his expression raw and unfiltered. But then, there's this pull. I want to tell you that it's just the house. I want to tell you that Bibbsy is a meddling creature who needs to be sacked. But every time I see you, every time I wake up and realize you're there, the world feels a little less grey. He reached out, his hand hovering near her sleeve, echoing the gesture from the library. This time, he didn't touch her. He just let his hand stay there, a silent offering of intimacy in the cold, grand gallery. "I'm terrified of you, Hermione," he confessed, the use of her name sounding like a prayer and a curse all at once. "I'm terrified that you'll look at me and see only the boy who made your life a living hell. And I'm even more terrified that you won't." Hermione felt a lump form in her throat. Her intelligence, her logic, her principles, all of them were shouting at her to walk away, to find a way to break the tether and run back to her safe, lonely flat. But her heart, the emotionally vulnerable core she kept hidden, was reaching out to him. She moved her arm, just an inch, until her sleeve brushed against his hand. The static was gone. In its place was a deep, resonant hum, a feeling of visceral alignment that made the very air in the gallery feel sweet. "I see you, Draco," she whispered. "I've seen you all week, and I don't think I'm as angry as I'm supposed to be." He looked at her, a flicker of something like hope lighting up his grey eyes. It was a fragile, dangerous thing, but in the heart of the storm-lashed manor, it was the only thing that felt real. The moment was interrupted by a loud crack from the centre of the gallery. Bibbsy appeared, clutching a tray of tea and looking immensely smug. "The compatibility is reaching 40%, she announced, her ears wiggling with delight. "The master and miss are finally speaking with their hearts, but more is needed. The magic requires a shared trial." Draco groaned, his hand dropping to his side. "A shared trial? Bibbsy, if you try to lock us in a room with a boggart, I will personally—" "No boggarts, master," Bibbsy chirped. "Only the ancient trial of the hearth. You must survive a night in the salarium without your wands. If you are still in each other's presence by dawn without drawing blood, the house will accept the bond." She snapped her fingers, and before Hermione could protest, the gallery dissolved into a blur of silver and green. When the world solidified again, they were standing in a glass-walled room at the very top of the manor's highest tower. The storm raged outside, lightning illuminating the gardens below in jagged flashes, and on the floor, in a neat, mocking pile, lay their wands. "Bibbsy!" Draco roared, rushing toward the glass door. It was locked, not with a physical key, but with a shimmering, translucent film of elven magic. Hermione walked to the center of the room, looking up at the rain lashing against the glass ceiling. The tension was back, but it was different now. It wasn't the tension of enemies. It was the tension of two people who had just been told that the only way out was to go through each other. "Well," she said, her voice shaking slightly as she looked at Draco. "I suppose we'd better find a place to sit. It's going to be a very long night." Draco turned away from the door, his face pale in the lightning light. He looked at her, at the room, and then at his own empty hands. "Granger," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "If we survive this, I'm going to kill that elf." "No, you won't," Hermione said, a small, weary smile touching her lips. "You're going to give her a raise. Because deep down, Malfoy, you're just as tired of being alone as I am." The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of the rain and the slow, steady rhythm of two hearts finally beginning to beat in unison. The salarium was an architectural paradox, a cage of delicate glass perched atop a fortress of heavy stone. Lightning fractured the sky, momentarily turning the world outside into a stark, monochromatic landscape of skeletal trees and rain-drenched gardens. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dormant jasmine and the sharp metallic tang of the storm. Without their wands, the space felt unnervingly vast. Hermione stood in the center of the circular room, her shadow stretching and shrinking with every flicker of the tempest. She felt stripped, her magical core humming with a phantom itch for the hawthorn wood that now lay uselessly on a velvet cushion near the locked exit. Draco remained by the door, his silhouette a jagged line against the translucent barrier. He didn't pace. He stood with a stillness that was more unsettling than agitation. The silver of his signet ring caught a flash of lightning, a solitary spark in the gloom. "She's forgotten the heating charms," Draco said, his voice flat, stripped of its usual melodic arrogance. "The trial isn't about comfort, I imagine," Hermione replied. She wrapped her arms around herself, the thin fabric of her pajamas offering no protection against the creeping chill. "It's about endurance. Or perhaps it's about the lack of distractions." Draco turned, and even in the dim light she could see the hollows of his cheeks. The internal conflict he had been battling all week was no longer a skirmish. It was a total war. He looked at her, not as a rival, not as a symbol of his past failures, but as the only solid thing in a world that had become a blur of elven whims and singing stones. "Come here, Granger, before you start shivering and blame me for the lack of hospitality." He sat on a low, velvet-tufted chaise longue that occupied the warmest corner of the room, near the internal wall. It was a command, but the edge was gone, replaced by a weary sort of resignation. Hermione hesitated, her mind calculating the distance, the implications, the sheer weight of the enemies to lovers script they seemed to be trapped in. She walked toward him, her footsteps silent on the thick rug. She sat on the very edge of the chaise, leaving a wide, cautious expanse of green velvet between them. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized by the atmospheric weight of the storm. Minutes bled into what felt like hours. Every time the thunder rolled, the glass rattled in its leaded frames, a reminder of how fragile their sanctuary was. "Why didn't you fight her harder?" Hermione asked suddenly. The question had been clawing at her throat since the kitchen. "In the gallery, you could have resisted the displacement. You're a Malfoy. You've been trained in the most restrictive forms of magic since you were 5. Why did you let her pull us here?" Draco leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes. "Because I was tired, Hermione." The use of her name again sent a jolt through her, a visceral alignment that made the air feel suddenly too thin. "I've spent years building walls," he continued, his voice a low rhythmic drone that mimicked the rain. "Walls against the ministry, walls against my mother's expectations, walls against the memory of everything. And then you appeared in my bed. The first morning, I thought it was a nightmare. The second, I thought it was a cruel joke. But the third..." He opened his eyes and looked at her, his gaze intense and uncomfortably honest. "On the third morning, I realized that for the 3 hours I spent asleep next to you, the walls were gone. I wasn't the Death Eater who got away. I wasn't the disgraced heir. I was just a man. And you were just a woman who steals the covers in her sleep. Hermione felt a flush that had nothing to do with the cold. I don't steal the covers. You do, he countered, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. You wrap yourself up like a disgruntled silkworm. It's quite inefficient. She let out a small, huffed laugh, a sound of genuine warmth that seemed to startle the shadows of the room. And you? You sleep like you're posing for a sarcophagus. It's unnerving. The tension shifted. The "can't stand it" was still there, a lingering ghost of their history, but it was being eclipsed by a "can't help but think" that was far more dangerous. Hermione looked at his hands, the long, pale fingers resting on his knees. She remembered the way they had felt on her wrist in the library, the jarring, electric impact of his touch. "Bibbsy said the stones sing because of me," she whispered. "Do you believe her?" Draco shifted, closing the gap between them by a few inches. The scent of sandalwood and winter air wrapped around her, a sensory embrace. "The manor is an old soul, Granger. It doesn't care about blood status or the war. It cares about magic that matches its own. You have a frequency that is loud. It's bright. It's everything this house hasn't been since my grandfather was a child." He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them. It was the same gesture from the gallery, but this time the air was thicker, more charged with intent. "I used to think my life was a script I had to follow," Draco said, his voice dropping to a rough, broken whisper. "But being with you, it feels like someone finally turned the lights on, and I'm terrified of what I'll see when I can finally see myself clearly." Hermione didn't wait for him to touch her this time. She leaned forward, her own hand reaching out to cover his. The contact was a lightning strike. A surge of warmth, golden and ancient, flooded through her, centering her in a way that made her breath hitch. It wasn't just a physical touch. It was a reconciliation of two fractured souls. Draco's fingers curled around hers, his grip tight, almost desperate. "You're not what they say you are," she said, her voice trembling. "And you're certainly not what you tell yourself you are." "And what am I, Hermione?" "You're someone who is finally awake," she replied. He moved then, a sudden, fluid motion that erased the last of the distance between them. He didn't kiss her, not yet. He simply pressed his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his breathing labored. The proximity was overwhelming. She could feel the heat of his skin, the frantic beat of his heart, and the sheer, unvarnished vulnerability of a man who had finally run out of places to hide. The storm outside seemed to fade into a distant murmur. The only thing that existed was the tactile friction of his hand in hers and the atmospheric pressure of their shared breath. It was a slow burn, a gradual erosion of a decade's worth of walls, leaving behind something raw and beautiful. "Bibbsy is going to be insufferable," Draco murmured against her skin. "She's already insufferable," Hermione whispered back, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. They sat there in the dark, two enemies turned into something neither could define, waiting for the dawn to prove that the magic wasn't a mistake. The conflict hadn't vanished. The guilt, the prejudice, the fear were all still there. But for the first time, they weren't fighting them alone. And in the silence of the salarium, the stones of Malfoy Manor began to hum. a low, resonant sound of satisfaction that vibrated through the floorboards and into their very bones. The trial wasn't over, but the outcome was already written in the singing of the house. As the first faint light of dawn began to grey the edges of the horizon, Draco finally pulled back, just enough to look into her eyes. The grey was no longer stormy. It was clear, like the air after a hex has cleared. "Saturday," he said, his voice regaining its strength. "We have a lot to talk about, Granger." "I think we've already started," she replied. And as the elven magic on the door shimmered and vanished, Hermione knew that while she might go back to her flat today, she would never truly be leaving this room behind. The tether had been pulled tight, and this time neither of them wanted to break it. The morning light that followed the storm was not the harsh, revealing glare Hermione had expected. Instead, it was a soft, pearlescent glow that washed over the glass walls of the salarium, turning the raindrops clinging to the panes into 1,000 tiny, shimmering diamonds. The air felt scrubbed clean, the heavy scent of ozone replaced by the delicate, waking perfume of the manor's gardens. Draco had not moved his hand from hers. His grip remained steady, a silent anchor in the aftermath of their shared vigil. The silence between them had transformed. It was no longer a jagged, uncomfortable thing born of mutual distrust, but a vast, quiet territory they were only beginning to map. "The door is open," Hermione whispered, her voice sounding unnervingly loud in the stillness. Draco looked toward the entrance, where the shimmering film of elven magic had dissolved into nothingness. He didn't jump to his feet. He didn't scramble for his dignity or retreat behind a curtain of snark. He simply looked back at her, his eyes tracing the line of her messy, sleep-deprived curls with an intensity that made her heart stutter. "Bibbsy is nothing if not punctual," he remarked, though his voice lacked its usual bite. He stood up slowly, offering his hand to help her up. When her palms slid against his, the sensation was no longer a shock. It was a recognition. The tactile friction that had once felt like a threat now felt like a homecoming. As she stood, her flannel pajamas, dotted with those ridiculous golden snitches, brushed against the heavy, dark silk of his dressing gown. The contrast was absurd, a visual testament to the collision of two worlds that should never have occupied the same orbit. They walked toward their wands in silence. As Hermione's fingers closed around the familiar vinewood, she felt a surge of her own magic return, but it felt different, infused with the resonant hum of the manor. She glanced at Draco, who was turning his wand over in his hands, his expression thoughtful. "I need a shower," she said, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of her appearance. "And coffee, large amounts of very strong coffee." "The manor provides," Draco said, a ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Though I suspect Bibbsy has already set a table that would shame a royal banquet. Follow me, Granger. Try not to get lost in the tapestries. They've been known to snag people they find interesting." They descended from the tower, their footsteps echoing in a rhythmic harmony. As they passed through the gallery again, the portraits seemed more animated than before. Great Aunt Cygnus actually blew a tiny painted kiss in their direction, which caused Draco to cough into his hand and walk slightly faster. The breakfast room was a glass-walled alcove overlooking the rose gardens. As predicted, the table was laden with silver domes, crystal carafes of juice, and a pot of coffee so fragrant it sight made Hermione's head swim. Bibbsy was nowhere to be seen, but the atmosphere was thick with her smug, invisible presence. Hermione sank into a velvet-backed chair, watching as Draco poured her a cup with practiced, elegant movements. "You're staring again," he noted, sliding the cup toward her. "I'm trying to reconcile this," she admitted, gesturing to the room, the food and him. "A week ago, we barely spoke in the ministry corridors, unless it was to argue over a filing deadline. Now, I'm in your house, wearing my pajamas, drinking your coffee after spending the night in a glass tower. It's statistically improbable." Draco sat opposite her, his silver ring clicking against the table as he rested his chin on his hand. "Magic doesn't care about statistics, Hermione. It cares about intent, and apparently my house has very strong intentions regarding you." He paused, the playfulness leaving his face. He looked out at the garden, where the roses were shaking off the last of the rain. "I've spent a long time trying to be invisible, you know? I thought if I stayed quiet enough, if I kept my head down and played the part of the reformed aristocrat, the world would eventually forget to hate me. But being invisible is just another way of being alone." Hermione watched the way the sunlight caught the pale hair at his temples. The internal guilt he carried wasn't a script. It was a physical weight, one that she could see in the slight slump of his shoulders. "You don't have to be invisible to be safe, Draco," she said softly. He looked back at her, his grey eyes searching hers. "And you? You don't have to be perfect to be loved, Granger. You don't have to carry the weight of the entire wizarding world on your shoulders just to prove you belong here." The air in the room grew heavy again, but it wasn't the suffocating pressure of a curse. It was the weight of an unspoken truth. Hermione felt her throat tighten. She had spent so much of her life being the brightest witch of her age, the girl with all the answers, the hero's anchor. She hadn't realized how exhausting it was until she saw the understanding in the eyes of her former enemy. "We're a pair of disasters, aren't we?" she said, a watery laugh escaping her. "The highest-rated disasters in the Malfoy archives," he agreed. They ate in a comfortable domestic silence that felt earned. The slow burn of their relationship wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a gradual thawing, a series of small, quiet victories over years of accumulated ice. After breakfast, Draco led her to the library. This time, there was no hostility. They spent the afternoon side by side, poring over the codex of bloodline affinities. Their shoulders occasionally brushed as they reached for the same parchment, a magnetic pull that no longer felt like a trap. "Look at this," Hermione said, pointing to a passage illuminated in gold ink. "When the hearth recognizes the soul of the displaced, the wards shall weave a bridge of dreams." It's the sleep apparition. Bibbsy wasn't just pulling you. The house was creating a path through your subconscious. Draco leaned in, his scent, sandalwood, parchment, and a hint of mint, filling her senses. "So, every time I thought of you, I was accidentally building a doorway." Hermione felt her heart give a traitorous leap. "Were you thinking of me, Draco?" He turned his head, his face inches from hers. The tension between characters was now so high, it felt like the air might catch fire. He didn't pull away. He didn't blink. "Every day," he confessed, his voice a low, vibrating rasp. "Every time I saw your name on a memo, every time I heard your voice in the atrium, I thought of how much I hated that I couldn't stop looking for you. I thought of how much I wanted to apologize for 1,000 things I didn't know how to put into words. He reached out, his hand ghosting over the curls at her neck. The non-verbal intimacy of the gesture was staggering. The house didn't start this, Hermione. It just finished it. Hermione felt the principled part of her mind finally surrender. She didn't want a logical explanation anymore. She didn't want to audit the wards. She wanted to be exactly where she was. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the silk of his lapel, pulling him a fraction closer. "Malfoy," she whispered. "Granger," he replied, his breath warm against her lips. The kiss wasn't a collision. It was a resolution. It was soft, tentative, and carried the weight of a decade's worth of unspoken words. It tasted of coffee and the cold residue of a storm, and it felt like the final piece of a very complex puzzle clicking into place. When he pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, Draco looked dazed. "Well," he breathed, "that certainly changes the incompatibility data." "I think the house is singing," Hermione murmured, closing her eyes. And it was. Far below them, in the ancient foundations of the manor, the stones were no longer hungry. They were humming a low, resonant chord of peace. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur of quiet conversations and shared silences. They walked through the gardens, Draco pointing out the rare magical flora his mother had cultivated, while Hermione explained the muggle science of botany. They sat in the library, not to argue, but to read together, their feet occasionally touching under the massive mahogany table. The broken prejudices were still being mended, the internal conflicts still being negotiated, but the foundation was now solid stone. On Sunday evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the manor in shades of bruised purple and gold, they stood by the fireplace in the main hall. "I should go," Hermione said, though she made no move toward the flue. "I have a briefing at 8 tomorrow morning." Draco looked at her, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "You could stay. I'm fairly certain Bibbsy has already prepared the compatibility guest suite, which I suspect is just my room with more flowers." Hermione laughed, a bright, clear sound that seemed to chase the last of the shadows from the hall. "I think I'll go home, Draco. I need to make sure my flat still exists, and that Mrs. Fig hasn't called the auras." She stepped into the green flames, clutching a handful of flue powder. But before she vanished, she turned back. "Malfoy?" "Yes, Granger. Don't wait for the house to bring you tonight. Just use the front door." He smirked, a genuine, brilliant Malfoy smirk that didn't have a drop of malice in it. "I'll bring the sandalwood." As the flames roared and took her home, Hermione felt a strange sense of completeness. She stepped out into her own living room, the scent of her own lavender-scented sheets greeting her. But as she looked at her bed, she realized it no longer felt like a sanctuary of solitude. It felt like a space waiting for a second occupant. She climbed into bed, drifting off to sleep with a smile on her lips. She woke the next morning to the scent of sandalwood and winter air. She didn't even open her eyes. She just reached out, her hand finding the warm, solid presence beside her. "Malfoy," she murmured sleepily, "you're in my bed again." "Actually," his voice came muffled by a pillow, "I believe this is my bed. Check the pillows, Granger." Hermione snapped her eyes open. She was back in the silver and green bedroom of the manor. "Bibbsy!" they both shouted in unison. From somewhere in the depths of the house, a tiny, triumphant cackle echoed through the stones. The young master was no longer lonely, and the house had never felt more alive. The Bibbsy conundrum was far from over, but as Draco pulled Hermione closer, shielding her from the morning light, neither of them seemed to mind the interference one bit. The ancient magic had made its choice, and for once the characters were more than happy to follow the script. The war was over, the ghosts were quiet, and in the heart of Malfoy Manor the stones were finally at rest. The realization that they were back in the manor, specifically in the vast emerald-draped expanse of Draco's master suite, hit Hermione with the force of a well-placed stupefy. Sunlight, thick and golden like poured honey, slanted across the heavy velvet hangings of the four-poster bed. The air was cool, smelling of beeswax and the faint, lingering scent of the jasmine from the salarium. Beside her, Draco didn't move. He lay on his back, one arm flung over his eyes, the other resting possessively across Hermione's waist. The weight of his forearm was a grounding presence, a warm pressure that anchored her to the reality of their situation. He looked utterly drained, the sharp lines of his face softened by a sleep so profound it seemed he hadn't moved an inch since the moment they had succumbed to exhaustion. "Malfoy," she whispered again, her voice a soft friction against the silence. He groaned, a low, guttural sound of protest. His fingers twitched against the silk of her pajama top, instinctively pulling her closer. "Go back to sleep, Granger. The sun is far too loud." "The sun isn't loud, Draco. And I was supposed to be in Bloomsbury. I was in Bloomsbury. I remember the flu. I remember the soot on my rug." She trailed off as he finally shifted, dragging his hand from his face to squint at her through a messy fringe of platinum hair. "Bibbsy," he rasped, the word a weary accusation directed at the ceiling. "She's intercepted the flu connection, or she's simply folded space-time around your flat until it became an annex of the manor. At this point, I wouldn't put it past her." He sat up, the duvet sliding down to reveal the smooth, pale expanse of his chest. The sight made Hermione's throat go dry. There was a raw, unpolished vulnerability to him in the morning light, a man stripped of his armor, his history, and his pride. He looked at her, his grey eyes searching her face for any sign of regret, any hint that the kiss in the library had been a momentary lapse in judgment. He found none. Hermione reached out, her fingers ghosting over the faint silver scars on his ribs, remnants of a war that felt 1,000 years away. The contact made him catch his breath, his muscles tensing beneath her touch, not in rejection, but in a visceral, magnetic alignment that made the air in the room hum. "We can't keep doing this," she said, though her hand didn't move. "The ministry will notice. Harry will notice. My neighbours are already suspicious of the sudden influx of aristocratic house elves in sandalwood." Draco's hand came up to cover hers, his palm warm and slightly rough. "Let them notice. Let the whole world watch as the most principled witch in Britain is abducted nightly by a reformed villain and his overzealous housekeeper. It'll be the first interesting thing to happen to the Daily Prophet in years." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The tension between characters was no longer a wall. It was a bridge, a shared frequency that made her head swim. I don't want you to leave, Hermione. I've spent my entire life in this house feeling like a tenant in a museum. But with you here, the air actually feels breathable. The slow burn of their chemistry flared into a sudden, intense heat. Hermione's fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him down until their lips met in a kiss that was desperate, hungry, and filled with a decade's worth of repressed longing. It wasn't the tentative exploration of the library, it was a claim. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, the atmospheric pressure in the room spiking with the sheer force of their combined magic. Draco looked dazed, his pupils blown wide until his eyes were almost entirely black. "Right," he breathed, his voice a ragged edge of its former self. "The investigation. We need to catch her in the act. If we don't confront her now, she'll have us married and producing heirs by Michaelmas." Hermione laughed, a bright, clear sound that seemed to make the silver embroidery on the bed hangings shimmer. "Then we need a trap, a proper Gryffindor-style ambush. And I know exactly what to use." The trap involved a complex web of monitoring charms, a modified sneakoscope, and a very specific type of elven frequency dampener that Hermione had been developing in her spare time at the Ministry. They spent the afternoon in the lower galleries, working in a silence that was now comfortable, punctuated by occasional distracted touches, a hand on a shoulder, a lingering look over a shared diagram. Draco's internal guilt manifested in a new way, a frantic, almost obsessive need to be helpful. He fetched books before she could ask, held the light as she adjusted the delicate brass gears of the dampener, and watched her with an expression of such profound, quiet adoration that it made her chest ache. He was a man rediscovering himself through the eyes of the woman he had once tried to destroy, and the transformation was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "The atmospheric pressure is rising," Hermione noted, glancing at her arithmancy readings. "She's coming. She's preparing for the nightly facilitation." "Stay behind the tapestry," Draco whispered, his hand whitening as he gripped his wand. "If she sees us both together, she might bolt. We need to catch her while the magic is active." They tucked themselves into a shallow alcove behind a heavy, medieval hanging depicting a hunt. The space was cramped, forcing them together until every inch of their bodies was in contact. Hermione could feel the steady thrum of Draco's heart against her back, his breath stirring the curls at the nape of her neck. The non-verbal intimacy of the moment was overwhelming. They were two souls waiting in the dark, connected by a thread that was no longer just elven magic. Suddenly, the air in the gallery grew heavy, smelling of ozone and fresh-baked bread. Bibbsey's signature magical footprint. A faint, golden glow began to coalesce in the center of the room, swirling into a miniature vortex of spatial displacement. In the center of the light stood Bibbsey. She was muttering to herself, a tiny, determined figure clutching a worn piece of parchment that looked suspiciously like a genealogical chart. "The young master is too stubborn," she squeaked, her ears flapping with every word. "He broods and he sighs, and Miss Granger is just as bad with her books and her schedules. If Bibbsey does not pull the thread, the tapestry will never be finished. Ancient indicators of compatibility do not lie. They are the highest truth." She raised her spindly arms, preparing to snap her fingers and initiate the apparition. "Now!" Hermione shouted. They burst from behind the tapestry, the monitoring charms flaring into a blinding white light that illuminated every corner of the gallery. Draco fired a silent Expelliarmus, not at the elf, but at the parchment in her hand, while Hermione slammed the dampener into the floor, a resonant, low-frequency hum vibrating through the stones. The golden vortex collapsed with a sound like a dying sigh. Bibbsy shrieked, her large eyes widening until they looked like tea saucers. She dropped the chart and scrambled backward, her tiny chest heaving with exertion. "Master Draco! Miss Granger!" she wailed, her voice cracking with a mixture of terror and indignation. "You are interfering with the house's destiny. You are breaking the bond." Draco stepped forward, his face a mask of aristocratic fury that Hermione knew was mostly a front for his own embarrassment. He looked down at the tiny elf, his shadow looming large against the ancient walls. "The bond, Bibbsy?" he asked, his voice a cold, dangerous rasp. "You've been kidnapping a high-ranking ministry official every night for a week. Do you have any idea the scandal this could cause? Do you have any idea how confusing this has been?" Bibbsy didn't cower. Instead, she burst into tears, large, silent sobs that shook her entire frame. She threw herself onto the floor, her forehead striking the cold stone with a sickening thud. "Give the ancient blood magic a chance!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the gallery. The manor was dying, Master. It was cold and it was empty. Bibbsy saw the Master looking at the photographs of the girl with the wild hair. Bibbsy saw the way the Master's magic changed when she walked past him in the ministry. It turned from grey to gold. Draco froze. His knuckles whitened as he gripped his wand, his gaze darting to Hermione and then back to the floor. I don't know what you're talking about." "Liar!" Bibbsy sobbed, hitting her head against the fireplace hearth now, a frantic, desperate gesture of elven devotion. "Master Draco is a liar to his own heart. He loves her. He has loved her since the year of the dragons and the fire. And Miss Granger, she is the only one who can see him. The house knows. The stones know. Bibby just wanted to be the one to open the door." The silence that followed was absolute. Hermione felt the world tilt on its axis. She looked at Draco, whose face had gone a ghostly, translucent white. He looked like he was about to collapse, his eyes fixed on the elf with a mixture of horror and a raw, exposed truth that he could no longer hide. "Draco?" Hermione whispered, her hand rising to her mouth. He didn't look at her. He looked at the fireplace, his breathing coming in jagged, shallow bursts. The internal conflict had finally reached its breaking point. The walls he had spent a lifetime building had not just been breached. They had been pulverized by the sheer, unvarnished honesty of a house elf. "I'm sorry," he choked out, his voice a broken, unrecognizable sound. "I'm so sorry, Hermione." He turned and fled, not toward his room, but toward the dark, winding stairs that led to the dungeons, leaving Hermione standing in the center of the glowing gallery with a weeping elf and a truth that was too big for the room to hold. The atmospheric pressure didn't dissipate. It intensified, the air growing thick with the weight of Draco's unspoken years of longing. Hermione looked at Bibbsy, then at the empty doorway where Draco had disappeared. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the ministry or her flat or the statistically improbable nature of her life. She ran. She followed the sound of his footsteps, the hollow echo of a man running away from the only light he had ever known. She found him in the old potions lab, a cold subterranean room filled with dust and the ghosts of his father's past. He was slumped against a workbench, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. "Draco," she said, her voice a soft, grounding anchor in the dark. He didn't look up. "Go away, Hermione. Please, just let the elf take you home one last time. I can't do this. I can't be the man she thinks I am. I'm the rot in the foundation. Remember? I'm the one who—" "No," she interrupted, walking toward him until she was close enough to feel the cold radiating from his skin. "You're the man who wakes up in my bed and makes me feel like the world is finally making sense. You're the man who kisses me in the library and makes the stones sing. Bibbsy didn't create that, Draco. You did." She reached out, her hand finding the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in the hair she had come to know so well in the dark. "Look at me." He raised his head slowly. His face was a map of his own internal destruction, red-rimmed eyes, tear-streaked cheeks, and a mouth that was trembling with a vulnerability that was almost too much to witness. "I love you," he whispered, the words sounding like a confession of a crime. "I've loved you since you punched me in the face when we were 13. I've loved you through the war and the trials and the silence, and I hate myself for it every single day." "Then stop," Hermione said, her own tears blurring her vision. "Stop hating yourself and start letting me love you back, because I think I've been waiting for you to wake up for a very long time." She leaned in, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was salty with tears and heavy with the weight of their shared history. It was the final shift, the moment when the enemies truly, finally became lovers. The tension was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant peace that vibrated through the floorboards and into the very heart of the manor. Above them, in the gallery, Bibbsy stopped crying. She dried her eyes on her tea towel, picked up the genealogical chart, and smiled. The young master was finally awake, and the house had never felt more like a home. The Bibbsy conundrum was over, but the story of Draco and Hermione was only just beginning. And as they walked back up the stairs, hand in hand, the stones of Malfoy Manor began to sing a new song. A song of gold, of light, and of a love that had finally found its way home. The air in the subterranean lab was stagnant, a graveyard of failed experiments and bitter memories. But as Hermione's lips pressed against Draco's, the cold seemed to retreat. The kiss was no longer a frantic collision of two desperate souls. It was a slow, deliberate anchoring. It was the tactile friction of a new reality being forged in the dark. Draco's hands, which had been trembling only moments before, found the small of her back, pulling her flush against him, as if he were trying to merge their very atoms. He tasted of salt and the sharp metallic tang of his own despair, but beneath it was the warmth she had come to recognize as his essence, sandalwood, and the quiet, steady hum of his magic. Hermione's fingers remained threaded through his hair, her nails lightly grazing his scalp, grounded by the physical reality of him. She could feel the vibration of a sigh deep in his chest, a surrender that felt more like a victory than any battle won. "I didn't think you'd follow," he whispered against her mouth, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. He didn't pull away. He simply tilted his head, his forehead resting against hers, their shared breath creating a small, warm microclimate in the freezing room. "I always follow the evidence, Draco," she murmured, her voice steadying as her heart found its rhythm. "And the evidence suggests that you are an idiot if you think I'm going anywhere now." She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. The grey was raw, stripped of its aristocratic lacquer, leaving behind a man who was fragile and remarkably whole all at once. The emotional brokenness he had carried was still there, but it was no longer a secret. It was a shared burden. "Bibbsy," he began, his jaw tightening. The things she said, about the photographs, about the ministry. "We'll deal with Bibbsy," Hermione interrupted, her thumb tracing the line of his lower lip. "We'll deal with the fact that you're a stalker in a silk robe later. Right now, we are going upstairs. We are going to find that elf, and then we are going to decide what we want, not what the house demands." Draco let out a dry, short laugh, a sound that carried the first genuine hint of relief. He stood up, straightening his robes with a reflexive twitch of his fingers, though the gesture was less about vanity and more about reclaiming his composure. He didn't let go of her hand. His grip was firm, his thumb tracing circles over her knuckles as he led her out of the gloom and back toward the light. As they climbed the stairs, the manor seemed to pulse with a renewed vigor. The atmospheric pressure was no longer a weight. It was a song. The portraits they passed were no longer silent observers. They were whispering, their painted eyes sparkling with a scandalous delight. Great Aunt Cygnus was practically vibrating in her frame, her fan fluttering so fast it was a blur. They found Bibbsy in the small drawing room. The elf had transitioned from hysterical despair to a state of hyper-focused efficiency. She was levitating a tea service, porcelain so thin it was translucent, and arranging a platter of lemon tarts with surgical precision. She looked up as they entered, her large eyes darting to their joined hands. She didn't squeak. She didn't bow. She simply set the teapot down and smoothed her starched tea towel. "The tea is Darjeeling. The tarts are from the recipe of the master's grandmother," she said, her voice possessing a terrifyingly calm authority. "It is time for the formalization of the intent." Draco stopped in the center of the room, his shadow stretching across the Aubusson rug. "Bibbsy, you are officially the most dangerous creature I have ever met. You have manipulated the wards, you have breached the privacy of a ministry official, and you have effectively held me hostage in my own mind." Bibbsy tilted her head, her ears twitching. "And is the master unhappy?" The question hung in the air, a blunt, unavoidable truth. Draco looked at Hermione, at the wild, untamed curls of her hair, the brilliance of her eyes, and the way she stood beside him like a fortress. "No," he said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant register. "The master is remarkably satisfied, but that does not excuse the methods. Ancient indicators of compatibility require ancient methods," Bibbsy countered, her chest puffing out. The master was fading. The master was a ghost in a house of ghosts. Bibbsy saw the threads of fate fraying. If Bibbsy did not weave them together, the Malfoy line would end in a whimper of paperwork and loneliness. Now, the magic is gold. The stones are singing. "We're not a bloodline project, Bibbsy," Hermione said, stepping forward. Her voice was firm, the principled witch reasserting her boundaries, even as she remained tethered to Draco. "You cannot just apparate people into beds because a chart tells you to. This is a relationship, not a breeding program." Bibbsy looked at Hermione with a gaze that was surprisingly wise. Miss Granger thinks she has a choice. Miss Granger thinks her heart did not already choose. The house just provided the room. The bed was just a convenient catalyst. The elf snapped her fingers, and a heavy, leather-bound volume zoomed from a nearby shelf, landing on the tea table with a resonant thump. It was the ancestral registry of the Malfoy hearth. "Read," Bibbsy commanded. Draco and Hermione leaned over the table. The pages were vellum, yellowed with age, but the ink was fresh. On the very last page, beneath the elaborate family tree, 2 names were appearing in a shimmering golden script. Draco Lucius Malfoy, Hermione Jean Granger. Between the names, a complex series of runes was forming, the symbols for intellect, resilience, and unity. But it was the rune in the center that made Hermione's breath catch. It was the ancient symbol for soul anchor. "The house has recognized the bond," Draco whispered, his fingers ghosting over the ink. "It's not a suggestion anymore, Hermione. It's an entry in the archives. It's permanent." The internal conflict flared one last time. Hermione looked at the names, at the gold ink that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. This was everything she had fought against. The idea of destiny over choice, of ancient magic over personal agency. But as she felt Draco's hand tighten on hers, she realized that the magic hadn't forced her to love him. It had simply removed the obstacles of pride and fear that had kept her from admitting it. She wasn't a victim of the magic. She was its fulfillment. "I suppose," Hermione said, her voice trembling with a mixture of amusement and awe, "that I should probably go home and pack a bag, since the manor seems to think I live here now." "Bibbsy has already packed the bag," the elf chirped, her eyes shining with triumph. "The flat in Bloomsbury is currently being aired out by the junior elves. Miss Granger's books are already being catalogued in the East Library." Draco groaned, burying his face in his hand. "You moved her library. Bibbsy, if you've damaged a single spine, I will—" "The books are safe, Master. Bibbsy knows the value of paper. They are arranged by the Granger method, which is very chaotic but very efficient." Hermione let out a laugh that was half sob. She turned to Draco, seeing the sheer absurdity and the terrifying beauty of the life that was opening up before them. The slow burn had reached its climax, and the fire was warm, bright, and endlessly welcoming. "Well, Malfoy," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder, "it seems you're stuck with me, and my chaotic library, and an elf who thinks she's a goddess of fate." Draco wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. The non-verbal intimacy was now a constant, a baseline of their existence. "I think," he said, kissing the top of her head, "that I can live with that, as long as I don't have to wake up in your bed alone ever again." "Not a chance," she promised. Bibbsy poured the tea, her ears wiggling with a rhythm of pure joy. The emotional seesaw had finally leveled out, finding its balance in the center of a room filled with sunlight, lemon tarts, and the impossible, wonderful truth of their love. The trial was over. The house was at peace. And for the first time in centuries, the Malfoy Manor wasn't just a fortress of history. It was a home for the future. The sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the drawing room. The silence was no longer heavy. It was a vessel for the quiet, simmering happiness that had taken root between them. "Saturday," Draco said suddenly, breaking the stillness. "What about it?" Hermione asked, her eyes closed as she leaned against him. "We were supposed to investigate the magic this weekend. I think we've been remarkably successful." "I think we deserve a holiday," she replied. "Somewhere without singing stones or meddling elves." "France?" he suggested. "I have a villa in the south. The wards are much more relaxed." "As long as there's a library," she countered. "There's a library, Granger, and a bed. Though I suspect we won't be spending much time in the library." The tension returned, but it was playful now, a flickering heat that made her smile against his chest. They sat there for a long time, watching the light fade. Two people who had found each other in the dark and had finally, mercifully decided to stay in the light. The Bibbsy conundrum had been resolved, but as Draco watched the way the sunset caught the gold in Hermione's eyes, he knew that the real magic was only just beginning, and it had nothing to do with ancient charts or elven spells. It was just the two of them, finally awake, finally home. The stones of the manor hummed one last deep chord of satisfaction, and then, for the first time in a week, the house fell into a quiet, contented silence. The bond was forged, the names were written, and the story was complete. But as Hermione reached for a lemon tart, her eyes sparking with a mischievous light, Draco knew that with her around, the silence would never be boring again. And that was the greatest magic of all. The following morning did not begin with the jarring impact of a magical displacement or the frantic ticking of a heart caught in a trap. Instead, it arrived with the slow, honeyed grace of a world that had finally found its axis. Hermione awoke to the sensation of weightless warmth, a vast, silken sea of linen, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man beside her. For the first time in a week, she didn't have to check the ceiling to know where she was. She was home, and home had shifted from a narrow flat in Bloomsbury to the solid, ancient heart of Malfoy Manor. Draco was still asleep, his face pressed into the crook of her shoulder. The sharp, aristocratic angles of his features were softened by a peace so profound it felt like a spell in itself. The internal guilt that usually tightened the corners of his mouth had evaporated, replaced by a soft, vulnerable slackness. Hermione lay still, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns of sunlight dancing across the emerald duvet. The tactile friction of his skin against hers was no longer a shock. It was the baseline of her reality. She thought about the Bibbsy conundrum and the sheer magnificent audacity of a creature who had looked at two of the most stubborn people in Britain and decided that the universe was wrong to keep them apart. The ancient indicators of compatibility had been right, of course, but it wasn't the magic that had won. It was the silence in the salarium. It was the way Draco had looked at her in the library, as if she were the first book he had ever truly learned to read. A soft pop echoed near the fireplace. Hermione didn't jump. She merely turned her head to see Bibbsy standing on the hearth, clutching two steaming mugs of cocoa and wearing a tea towel that had been embroidered with a tiny golden G intertwined with an M. "The young master and miss are finally synchronized," the elf whispered, her large eyes shining with a pride that bordered on the divine. "The house is breathing again. Bibbsy has brought the morning restorative. It is infused with peppermint for clarity and honey for sweetness." "Thank you, Bibbsy," Hermione murmured, reaching out to take a mug. "But I believe we discussed the facilitation of my library," I found my copy of Hogwarts, a history in the section for fictional architecture. We need to have a serious talk about your classification system. Bibbsy tilted her head, her ears giving a small defiant wiggle. The book is about a building that does not exist in the Muggle world, miss. Therefore, it is architecture of the imagination. It is perfectly logical. But Bibbsy will accept a compromise if the miss agrees to stay for the Midsummer Gala. Draco stirred then, his hand tightening around Hermione's waist as he pulled her closer, his eyes fluttering open to meet the elf's gaze with a look of mock sternness. The gala, Bibbsy, we haven't even survived breakfast, and you're planning a ball? A house that sings needs an audience, Master Draco, Bibbsy stated firmly, setting the second mug on the nightstand. And the world needs to see that the Malfoy name is no longer a shadow. It is a light. Now drink. The peppermint will help with the emotional residue of the transition. With another pop, she was gone, leaving behind only the scent of chocolate and triumph. Draco sat up, leaning back against the ornate headboard and pulling Hermione with him. He took a sip of the cocoa, his expression one of weary, happy resignation. She's won, you know. We're just living in her world now. We're merely the decorative elements of her grand design. I don't mind being decorative, Hermione teased, her fingers playing with the silver buttons of his pajama top. As long as the company is good. Draco's face went serious, the tension returning for a fleeting second, but this time it was purely romantic, a magnetic pull that drew his gaze to hers. Hermione, I meant what I said in the lab, about the years I spent looking for you. I don't want this to be a magical accident that we tolerate. I want it to be the only thing that matters. It is, she said, her voice catching. I've spent so much time being the golden girl, the one who fixes everything, that I forgot I was allowed to be happy. You didn't just wake me up in your bed, Draco. You woke me up to the fact that I don't have to do it all alone. The kiss that followed was a resolution, a final, beautiful confirmation of the bond that the house had recognized long before they had. It was slow, tasting of peppermint and honey, and it carried the weight of a decade's worth of unspoken longing, finally finding its voice. The rest of the morning was a blur of non-verbal intimacy and quiet domestic revelations. They explored the East Library together, with Hermione spending 3 hours reorganizing her books, while Draco watched her from a velvet armchair, a book of his own ignored in his lap. He didn't offer to help. He knew better than to interfere with her Gryffindor organizational fury. But he stayed close, his presence a steady, sandalwood-scented warmth in the room. The internal conflicts hadn't vanished entirely. They were too complex for a single week to resolve. Draco still felt the bite of his past, and Hermione still struggled with the sudden loss of her carefully curated independence. But the emotional seesaw had stopped swinging wildly. It had found its center, a point of balance where they could stand together and face the world. As the sun reached its zenith, casting long, brilliant rays through the library windows, they walked out onto the terrace. The gardens were in full bloom, a riot of colour and fragrance that seemed to vibrate with the manor's renewed energy. I have to go to the ministry for a few hours, Hermione said, leaning against the stone balustrade. Kingsley is expecting a report on the Gringotts protocol, and I suspect Harry is currently organising a search party for my missing flat. Draco stood beside her, his hand resting over hers on the cold stone. Tell them the truth, or a version of it. Tell them that you've been recruited for a high-level research project at Malfoy Manor. It's technically true. We are researching the ancient indicators of compatibility, after all. I think I'll just tell them that I found something I didn't know I was looking for, she replied, looking up at him with a smile that made his heart perform a jagged, happy somersault. Saturday, he reminded her, his eyes sparkling with a mischievous light. France. No elves, no singing stones, just a library and a very large bed. I'll hold you to that, Malfoy. She reached for her travel cloak, which Bibbsy had conveniently placed on a nearby chair. But before she could put it on, Draco pulled her back for one last kiss. It was deep, lingering, and filled with the promise of 1,000 more mornings. See you tonight, Granger, he whispered against her ear. And try to stay in your own bed until I get there. I'd hate for Bibbsy to have to do all the work. I make no promises, she laughed, stepping into the green flames of the flue. The story of the Malfoys and the matchmaker didn't end with a wedding or a grand proclamation. It ended with a quiet, persistent happiness that infiltrated every corner of the ancient house. Bibbsy continued to facilitate their lives with a terrifying efficiency, but she no longer had to apparate them across London. They found their way to each other quite easily on their own. Draco Malfoy became a fixture in the ministry atrium, not as a disgraced heir, but as a man who walked with a purpose and a quiet, confident light. Hermione Granger remained the brightest witch of her age, but she learned to leave her work at the door, trading her schedules for the sandalwood-scented peace of the manor. The Bibbsy conundrum became a family legend, a story of a house elf who was wiser than the wizards she served, and a house that was smarter than the history that had tried to break it. And every night, as the moon rose over the salarium and the stones began their low, resonant hum, Draco and Hermione would find their way to the green velvet chaise, watching the stars and laughing at the absurdity of a love that had started with a scream in the dark and ended with a kiss in the light. The enemies to lovers' arc was complete. The prejudices were broken, and the slow burn had become a steady, enduring flame. In the heart of Malfoy Manor, the ghosts were gone, the doors were open, and for the first time in history, the magic wasn't a weapon or a burden. It was simply home. And as Bibbsy tucked a sprig of fresh lavender under Hermione's pillow that night, she smiled to herself. The apex match was secure, the bloodline was thriving, and the young master was, at long last, truly awake. The ancient magic had finished its work, and the rest, as they say, was history. Or, as Hermione would point out, it was the beautiful, unpredictable architecture of a future they were building together, one brick and one kiss at a time. The manor fell into a deep, contented silence, its stones no longer singing for attention, but humming a quiet song of rest. The story was over, but the love was just beginning, and in the wizarding world, that was the greatest magic of all. The air in the grand ballroom of Malfoy Manor was no longer heavy with the suffocating weight of history or the lingering chill of a cold aristocratic past. Instead, it was thick with the scent of 1,000 white roses, the warm aroma of mulled cider, and the electric, vibrant hum of a house that had finally learned how to breathe. It was midsummer, the night Bibbsy had prophesied months ago, and the manor was ablaze with a light that had nothing to do with the flickering candles floating near the vaulted ceiling. Hermione stood on the balcony overlooking the gardens, her fingers tracing the cool, smooth stone of the balustrade. She was wearing a gown of deep, shimmering emerald, a colour that had once represented a divide between them, but now felt like a shared heritage. The silk flowed around her like water, catching the silver rays of the moon. She felt a profound sense of visceral alignment with the world around her, a stillness in her mind that had replaced the frantic, overwound clockwork of her previous life. She didn't have to turn to know he was there. The magnetic pull began at the base of her spine, a familiar, warm resonance that signaled his approach. The scent of sandalwood and winter air wrapped around her, a sensory embrace that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up in greeting. "You're hiding again, Granger," Draco said, his voice a low melodic friction that vibrated in the quiet night air. He stepped up beside her, leaning his elbows on the stone. He was dressed in black velvet, the silver embroidery on his cuffs catching the moonlight. He looked remarkably different from the man she had woken up next to on that first chaotic morning. The internal guilt that had once caved his chest in was gone, replaced by a quiet, grounded strength. He looked like a man who had finally stopped running from his own reflection. "I'm not hiding," Hermione replied, a soft smile playing on her lips. "I'm observing. It's quite a sight, isn't it? Harry and Ron actually sharing a drink with Theo Knott. My parents discussing Muggle dentistry with your mother. It shouldn't work, statistically speaking." "Statistics be damned," Draco murmured, his hand sliding across the stone to cover hers. The tactile friction was a constant comfort now, a grounding wire that connected them. "The stones are singing so loudly I can barely hear the orchestra. I think Bibbsy has added a joy infusion to the punch." "I wouldn't put it past her." Hermione laughed, turning her hand to interlace her fingers with his. "She's currently in the kitchens, presiding over the house elves like a diminutive queen. I saw her wearing a diamond-encrusted tea towel earlier. I assume that was your doing?" "A reward for services rendered," Draco admitted, his grey eyes sparkling with a mischievous light. "She did, after all, save us from a lifetime of being insufferably lonely and remarkably bored. A few diamonds seem like a small price to pay for my sanity." They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the fireflies dance over the rose bushes. The slow burn of their relationship had transformed into a steady, enduring flame, a heat that didn't consume but sustained. The broken prejudices were now nothing more than dust under their feet, and the internal conflicts had been replaced by a shared project of building a future that belonged to neither the old world nor the new, but to both. "I went to the flat today," Hermione said suddenly, her voice dropping to a whisper. Draco stiffened slightly. "To move the rest of the books?" "No," she said, turning to face him. "To hand over the keys. Mrs. Figg was quite disappointed. She told me she'd never seen a nun move out with such an expensive-looking brother." Draco let out a sharp, genuine laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed through the gardens. He pulled her closer, his hands finding the small of her back, the silk of her gown sliding beneath his palms. The non-verbal intimacy between them was staggering, a language of touches and looks that didn't require the interference of words. "So, It's official, he asked, his forehead resting against hers. You're officially a permanent fixture of the Malfoy archives? I'm the soul anchor, remember? She teased, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. The gold ink doesn't lie. I believe I'm contractually obligated to keep you from brooding too much. A full-time job, he conceded, his breath warm against her lips. But I think the benefits package is exceptional. He kissed her then, a deep, resonant kiss that tasted of cider and the cool night air. It was a kiss of final resolution, a sealing of the bond that had been forged in the dark and tempered in the light. The manor seemed to hum beneath their feet, a low, satisfied vibration of ancient stones that were no longer hungry for blood, but full of life. The atmospheric pressure of the night was perfect. The stars were brilliant. The music from the ballroom was a distant, happy murmur, and the man holding her was exactly where he was meant to be. As they eventually pulled apart, Draco looked out at the horizon, where the first faint glow of the midsummer dawn was beginning to grey the edges of the sky. I used to hate the morning, he said, his voice a low rasp of honesty. It always felt like a deadline, a reminder of everything I hadn't fixed. But now... Now? Hermione prompted. Now. I can't wait to wake up, he said, looking back at her with an expression of such profound, quiet adoration that it made her chest ache. Even if I have to fight you for the duvet. You'll always lose that fight, Malfoy, she reminded him. I know, he smiled. It's my favorite part. They walked back into the ballroom, hand in hand, two people who had been pulled through the eye of a needle by a meddling elf and a singing house, only to find that the world on the other side was much bigger and much brighter than they had ever imagined. Bibbsy stood by the great oak doors, watching them pass. She straightened her diamond-encrusted towel, took a final sip of her peppermint restorative, and gave a sharp, satisfied nod. The young master was happy. The miss was home. The ancient indicators of compatibility had been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. As the sun rose over Malfoy Manor, painting the white roses in shades of pink and gold, the house finally fell silent. It didn't need to sing anymore. The music was inside, in the laughter of the guests, the clinking of glasses, and the quiet, steady rhythm of two hearts that had finally found their way to the same bed, and stayed there by choice. The Bibbsy conundrum was over, but the life they were building was only just beginning. And as Hermione leaned her head against Draco's shoulder, watching the dawn of a new era, she knew that for the first time in her life, she didn't need to know what was next. Whatever it was, they would face it together in a house that finally knew the meaning of the word welcome. The stones were at rest, the names were written in gold, and the magic, the real magic, was everywhere.
Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. I wanted to write about something more than just magic. This is a story about walls. We all build them. We build them to stay safe. We build them to hide our mistake. Draco and Hermione did this for a long time, but sometimes life has other plans, or in this case, a very stubborn house elf. I think love is like the magic in this house. It is loud, it is persistent, it does not care about your pride, it only cares about the truth. Draco and Hermione were enemies, but really they were just two lonely people. They needed someone to open the door, I hope this story made you smile. I hope it reminded you that it is okay to be vulnerable. It is okay to let someone in, even if you wake up in the wrong bed sometimes. Thank you for listening. Thank you for loving these characters. And remember, the stones are always singing. You just have to listen. Until next time, goodbye.